He looked back at the Lerwick skyline, the stone houses, the church spires, and the flickering lights of the harbor. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. The ghosts were still there, Fran, Mima, Hattie, Elspeth, but they weren't shadows anymore. They were part of the landscape, part of the story that made the islands what they were. Cassie would be home for Christmas in a few days. They would sail together, and he would tell her about Elspeth and the loom. He would tell her that history isn't just a record of what happened. It's a living thing that we carry with us, in our blood and in our bones. Shetland was a land of salt and stone, of silence and song. It was a place where the past was never truly gone, and the future was as vast as the North Sea. Jimmy Paris steered the blue boat toward the horizon, a small, brave light in the gathering dark. He was ready for whatever the tide brought next. Chapter 31, The Tide of Remnants. The new year arrived not with a whimper, but with a roar. A succession of Atlantic depressions battered the islands, carving new scars into the cliffs and washing up debris that had likely been circling the Arctic for decades. Jimmy Perez was at his desk, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee, when the call came from the Coast Guard at Scalloway. "Jimmy, we've got something you might want to see," the voice said, crackling over the line. "It's washed up in the shallows near the old whaling station. Looks like a piece of a hole, but there's something else. A container, sealed in lead. Lead." The word sat heavy in Jimmy's mind. Lead was used for two things at sea: ballast or burial. He arrived at the whaling station an hour later. The rain was a horizontal sheet, biting at any exposed skin. The wreckage was a mangled rib of oak, black as coal from its time in the deep. Beside it lay a small, rectangular box, its lead casing dull and pitted by the salt. "We haven't opened it," the Coast Guard officer said, shielding his eyes from the spray. "Waiting for you." Jimmy knelt in the wet sand. He used a crowbar to pry open the soft metal. Inside was a leather pouch, stiff and white with salt, and within that, a series of journals wrapped in oiled silk. These weren't resistance records. These were logs from a vessel called the Nordstern and the North Star, a ship that had been recorded as lost with all hands in February 1944. Chapter 32, The Oslo Inquiry. The discovery of the Nordstern journals reopened a door that Jimmy thought had been safely locked. The journals didn't belong to a sailor. They belonged to a high-ranking Norwegian officer who had been on a secret mission to meet with the Weaver. Jimmy decided he couldn't handle this from Lerwick. He needed to go to the source. A week later, he was on a flight to Oslo, leaving Tosh in charge of the station. Oslo was a city of glass and light, a stark contrast to the brooding atmosphere of Shetland. He met Sigrid again, who had come down from Bergen to assist him. The Nordstern wasn't just a transport ship, Sigrid said as they sat in the Ministry of Defense archives. It was carrying the blueprints for the new German fortifications on the Norwegian coast. blueprints that were supposed to be delivered to the British intelligence in Shetland. But it never arrived, Jimmy noted. Because it was intercepted, Sigrid whispered. The journals mention a contact who gave away their coordinates. Someone they trusted. A man named Magnus Haldane. Jimmy felt a sick thud in his chest. Magnus Haldane, Jackie's father, the man whose statue people had wanted to tear down. The hero of the island. Chapter 33. A Legacy in Iron. The deeper Jimmy dug into the Oslo archives, the more the myth of the Shetland bus began to crumble and reform into something more tragic. Magnus Haldane hadn't been a collaborator in the traditional sense. He hadn't been working for the Nazis. He had been a victim of a different kind of war. The journals revealed that the Nazis had captured Magnus's younger brother, a boy of 18, and threatened to execute him unless Magnus provided the Nordstjernen's position. Magnus had complied, thinking he was sacrificing a ship to save his blood. But the Germans had lied. They sank the ship and executed the brother anyway. Magnus had returned to Shetland a broken man, carrying a secret that was heavier than any gold. He had spent the rest of the war performing acts of suicidal bravery, trying to pay back a debt that could never be settled. He became a hero because he was trying to find a way to die. He wasn't a traitor, Jimmy, Sigrid said, placing a hand on his arm. He was a man caught between two impossible choices. He spent 40 years being a legend to hide the fact that he was a ghost. Chapter 34. The Homecoming. Jimmy returned to Shetland with the truth in his pocket. He didn't go to the station first. He drove to Bresse, to the small churchyard where Magnus Haldane was buried, not far from Mima and the Redbones. He found Jackie there, tending to the family plot. She looked older, her sharp features softened by the winter cold. "You've been away," she said, her voice neutral. "I have. I was in Oslo." Jackie stopped her weeding. She didn't look up. "And what did you find?" "More names for the list. I found the journals of the Nordstjernen," Jimmy said gently. He told her the real story of her father and his brother. He told her about the choice Magnus had made and the burden he had carried. Jackie listened in silence, her hands trembling as she clutched a fistful of dead heather. When he finished, she finally looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "He never said," she whispered. "He never told any of us. He just sat in that chair by the fire, year after year, looking at the sea like it was his enemy. He was trying to protect you. Jackie, he thought if you knew, you'd hate him." "Hate him?" She barked a short, sad laugh. "He was my father. I only wanted him to be at peace." Chapter 35. The Eternal North. The release of the Nordstjernen findings did what the initial disclosure could not. It brought a sense of empathy to the islands. The black and white world of heroes and villains faded into a spectrum of human frailty and sacrifice. The petition to remove the names was not just dropped. It was replaced by a proposal for a new plaque, one that honored the silent choices of the war. Jimmy stood on the Bresse Ridge one final time before the winter truly settled in. Beside him was Sandy, who had come back for a few days to help Joseph